those words in the contract. So, the concept is that if you are the party who is writing the contract, you have an obligation to make that contract as clear as possible. And for this, I would take you to the chapter 14 of John. Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father but by me, referring to himself. That's pretty clear. There's no ambiguity in there. And God makes this very clear. The only way to be saved is through his Son, Jesus. By grace are you saved through faith, not of yourself. It's a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. That's Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. So, God has made his contract as clear as possible. Book of Romans, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. There is ambiguity in that. What do you mean, calls upon the name of the Lord? If I just shout, hey, Jesus, does that get me in? Well, if we go to a court of law and it says anybody who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, and God does not define that term, what he means by calling upon the name of the Lord, then yeah, that might be all it takes to get saved. Excuse me, when I use that voice, I'm not like Dave. I use a different voice and my voice decides to go out on me. So, if you don't make the terms clear in the contract, and there is more than one possible interpretation to a phrase or to a word in the contract, then by all means, the courts are going to rule in favor of the person who signed the contract, not the person who wrote it. So, a contract is a legally binding agreement between the parties. Now, in an actual legal contract, contracts fall under what they call the civil court system. You're going to civil court if there's any dispute as to what this contract says or what it means or what it covers. So let me just jump into the next rule that we deal with when dealing with contract law. The court has to use this rule. Every word, every phrase, every provision is there for a reason. It is there to serve a purpose. And there have actually been several case laws that I was dealing with where the people come before the court and says, well, yes, that is what it says, but that can't be what it means. What do you mean? Well, we don't like how that one's interpreted. Doesn't matter. Every word, every phrase, every provision has to be analyzed. And the court says that you can't come before the court and argue, oh, they were just throwing in some extra words. They were getting paid by the words. They just threw this in so it would sound better, but they don't really mean it. Yeah, they do. If it's in the law, it's part of the law. And if it's part of the law, it's enforceable. So be very, very careful what you do with a law or a contract. So, how does this affect the concept of interpreting a law? That means that when I'm looking at a law and I'm preparing to go to court to challenge this law or to enforce this law, I literally have to look at each and every word that's there in the law. If you've ever watched the lawmakers, not the TV series, but the actual people up in Sacramento and in Washington that make the laws, you will find out that they will debate for hours over which word to use. For example, Labor Code 15, very profound labor code. It just simply says, shall is mandatory. May is permissive. What does that mean? It means that if the law says you shall do this, it is mandatory for you to do that. And if you don't do that, you have broken the law, or you have not properly applied the law. Whereas if they put the word may in the law, you may do this, that's permissive. And the parties can decide if they want to do it or not. And if they do it, that's fine. If they don't do it, that's fine. Individual words carry a great weight in legal interpretation. So, you have to look at every word. You have to consider each phrase, and you have to deal with each provision. It's kind of like one of those Tinker Toy games where you take everything apart and you set it out on the table and you figure out, wow, what does this do? And wow, what's this? And how does this work? And once you're done figuring it all out, you have to put it back together. And if you don't put it back together, it doesn't work. Same thing with interpreting a law. You take it apart word by word, phrase by phrase, provision by provision. You figure out what they say, what they mean. You may have to go to the dictionary to find out the meaning of the word, and then you put it all back together. If you don't do this, then your interpretation of the law will probably be incorrect. And if any of you have ever gone to court, you go to court and you have looked at the law and you figure, okay, this is what the law demands. And over here this is what the facts of the case are. Do I comply with the law? Have I done everything the law told me to do? And if you did, then you probably should win before the court. But if you've got the wrong interpretation of the law, you don't understand how the law works or what it really says, if you take that case to trial, you're going to go down in flames. You're going to lose. And again, in this situation, it's not that you're going to have to pay a traffic ticket. It's not that you're going to have to basically pay for that dent in your car because the insurance company doesn't cover it. It's not going to be the fact that you didn't do something and you might get a ticket for jaywalking. We're talking about your eternal soul. And if they have interpreted the law incorrectly, and you go before the court and you make the wrong argument, that is going to affect your eternal destiny. Last week I joked about salvation, the alternate plan. And if you go before the court and say, oh, I did what the law said, I went out and I knocked on doors and I talked about Jesus till I was blue in the face, I have to be saved. God pulls out the real plan and compares it to your alternative. And it says, not of works, lest anyone should boast. You don't work your way to heaven. You accept the gift of salvation through God's grace based upon your faith. Did you trust Jesus to save you? Oh, no. I've got the alternative plan. I went out and I did it all myself. I didn't bother with Jesus. He's too busy for me. Guess where you're going to be going? You get in front of God and say, oh, look, I did what I was supposed to do. I went to the church. I got baptized in the church. I got married in the church. And I obeyed all the tenets and all the requirements that are listed in the Book of Mormon and in Doctrine and Covenant and in Pearls of Great Price. So, yeah, that's what I did. So let me in. See, I got the alternative plan. And God's going to be looking here and say, which Jesus were you listening to? Oh, he was one of God's spiritual sons. He had a lot of them, but this one, he let him come to earth. Which Jesus is this? Oh, he is the one who was the spiritual brother of Lucifer. Wait a second. That is not who my son is. You listened to the wrong person. You got the wrong contract. Your alternate plan does not work. You're not covered. We're talking about something that serious. It's not just winning a debate. It's not just, well, gee, I'm right and you're not, or I'm in the know and you're not. We're talking about a legal system. And your opinion of the law does not count if you don't interpret it correctly and you don't argue it correctly. So, all of these things I've talked about are going to apply to God's contract with mankind, because this is a contract and contract law applies. But any document that the courts put out, Book of Mormon, New World Translation, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, the alternative plan, doesn't matter what they present, it's going to have to meet the same standard. And the standard we're going to hit you with is the fact that you don't have the legal authority to change the contract. Your contract with death is null and void. Your contract with hell will not hold up in a court of law. You're lost and you're going to hell. So this is the thing that we really, really, really need to stress. We're not just talking about theology. We're not just talking about a collection of beliefs. We are talking about contract law and a legal system. And when you stand before God, that will be a court of law, and God will be the judge. And this is the contract that he is going to use to make his decision about where you're going to spend your eternal destiny. He's not going to look at the Book of Mormon. He doesn't care about the Book of Mormon. He doesn't care about the New World Translation. He cares about the Bible. So Paul followed the same concept of contract law, legal analysis, legal theory. And he gave us something to work with along the same lines as every word, every phrase, every provision serves a purpose. In his case, he gave us 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. All Scripture is inspired by God. That's where it came from. God wrote it. It is profitable, or it is good for teaching. It is good to rebuke when people teach you false doctrines like the Book of Mormon or the New World Translations. It is good for correcting misinformation. Does it really say that? Well, let's take a look and see what it says. And oh yeah, that's what it says. It's also good to train you in righteousness. Righteousness is simply right thinking, right attitudes, and right actions. And the right is that it's going to be in agreement with what God wants you to do. So this is the template. This is the standard. And if we do this, we are going to be complete. We are going to be equipped, trained, supplied for every good work that we do for God. So the Latter-day Church actually has a similar standard. I like this. This was given by Brigham Young. He's the number 2 guy back at the beginning. And he says, take up the Book of Mormon. No, that's not what it says. Take up Doctrine and Covenants. No, that's not it either. Take up the pearl of great price. No. Brigham Young said, take up the Bible. The Bible, not the documents produced and published by the Latter-day Church. Now, I think that's where he made his first mistake. Because when we come back to the Bible and we do what he tells us to do, it does not line up with the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants or the Pearl of Great Price. Take up the Bible and compare the religion of Latter-day Saints. Compare the religion of the Latter-day Saints with the Bible and see if it will stand the test. So we get to use the Bible to test what they are teaching. This is from his Journal of Discourses back in 1854 to 1856. And if you want to find the actual message, it's in chapter 16, verse 46, out of their own documents. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses are fun people in the Green Book. They also have an appeal to the Bible. And it says 2 Corinthians 13:5. Examine yourselves whether you are in the faith. Prove your own selves. Know you not that you're in Jesus Christ unless you are reprobates? So even the Jehovah's Witnesses want us to examine ourselves. If you're going to examine something, you need the template or the master to examine yourself by. It's going to be the Bible. So let me just start off with the Bible. The Bible claims to be written by God. The Bible claims that it is written over a period, and depending upon how you count it, it can be anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 years. At the same time, it was written in different countries. It was written in different languages, and the amazing thing is that it was also written, it was also written by 40 different authors. And these 40 different authors did not know each other, except for when you get into the New Testament and you have some of the disciples know each other. So here it is in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. God, that's the big guy, God, who at different times and in various manners spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets. So this is the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a collection of God speaking to mankind through prophetic revelation. There were people who could hear God. There were people that God spoke to, and these people wrote down what God told them to say. Now, after talking through the prophets, now has in these last days, meaning the New Testament period, spoken unto us by his Son. That would be Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was God born into the human race. God came down into his creation. And then God, through Jesus Christ, taught the disciples. And the disciples wrote what he taught them. So has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things. And this is going to upset the Mormons. By whom he also made the worlds. That is with an S. That is plural. The Mormon Church teaches that when you die, if you've all been a good little Mormon boy, you will become your own God. You will be allowed to build your own planet, and you'll be allowed to populate your planet so people will worship you. So in their philosophy, the God of this world only made one planet. He only made Earth. And somebody else made everything else out there. Well, right here, God spoke through Jesus. He spoke to the disciples, and the disciples have identified that not only did God speak through Jesus, Jesus was God, and God, i.e. Jesus, made all the worlds. The entire universe is his creation. One creator, not many. So these writings were collected and put into a series of tests. Now, one of the things I wanted to stress here about these series of tests, this was not a one-time thing. You see, we're going to go all the way back to a gentleman by the name of Job. And Job, from all indications, was about 400 years before Moses was even born. That makes the book of Job the oldest book in the Bible, and it makes Job the earliest revelation. So, if God is revealing himself, you start with the earliest revelation. Now, Job had 3 witnesses. He had his 3 friends, and they were there when God showed up in the whirlwind. And they heard what God said to Job. 4 people witnessed God appearing in a whirlwind and teaching the world who he was and what he was going to do. In addition to that, we move ahead that 400 years and we come to Moses. And Moses gets his revelation from the burning bush. And God continues to speak to him. And as proof that God was speaking through him, God gave him the ability to perform certain miracles. Now, one of those was to take a staff, throw it down on the ground, and it would turn into a serpent. Another thing he had, he could put his hand inside his robe, pull it out, and it would be a leper's hand. You could put it back in, and it comes out, and it's fine. He also could do things like, well, turn water into blood. He could put boils on people. He could have everything dark and everywhere except in the land of Goshen. He could basically have the angel of death show up and kill every firstborn except for those of the Jews. And then the big one, he parted the Red Sea. And the way the Bible describes it was the water stood up like a wall on either side, and they walked through on dry ground. So this theory from somebody coming in after the fact that the tide just pulled back and there was a little path that they could walk does not match the description of the eyewitnesses. Now, Moses wrote all of this down. First 5 books in the Bible are his. And he told us exactly what was happening. Now, he had about 2 to 3 million people with him out there in the wilderness. So, if he was lying, he had about 2 to 3 million people that could point the finger at Moses and say, "You're lying." None of the children of Israel did that. They all saw the same things that he saw. They saw him do the things that he did. They all were there when God came down, and you heard God verbally deliver the 10 Commandments. It wasn't like the movie with Charlton Heston. Moses was not up in the mountain, and God was speaking there. God came down in a cloud, and he began to verbally deliver the 10 Commandments to the children of Israel. They got so freaked, they went to Moses and said, make him stop. Make him stop. You know, we're terrified. You go talk to God. Let God tell you what we're supposed to hear, and we'll listen to you. But make him stop. I mean, my knees won't stop shaking, you know. So, at that point, you have God's earliest revelation in the book of Job. You have God's second revelation in the 5 books of Moses. Everything that came after that had to line up with those earliest revelations. And it wasn't just one time, because we're talking about 2,000 years here before Jesus comes along. There was 2,000 years from Adam and Eve until we get the law. Once we get the law, we have 2,000 years from the law until you get to Jesus. For 2,000 years, you have, I would say hundreds of thousands, but I'm going to take the shot and say up to at least 1 million different rabbis who are looking at these documents, questioning these documents, putting these documents to the test. There's a whole book out there called The Lost Books of the Bible and the Forgotten Books of Eden. Let me just burst the bubble. Nobody lost them, and nobody forgot them. They put them to the test, and they failed. Somebody other than God was writing them. So you have hundreds of thousands of rabbis looking at these forgotten books of Eden, and they're going, that's not historical. That's not right. No, that never happened. Where did they get this from? And so they started tossing these books out. They weren't allowed to be part of God's revelation. So, these writings were collected and put into a series of tests. And the first test comes from the book of Malachi. Malachi was a prophet, and he says, I am the Lord, I do not change. For I am the Lord, I do not change. Malachi 3:6. That was a declaration from God. This is something that God revealed about himself. So we have to make sure that what we're looking at is of God. And the first way you can test that is that God doesn't change. So if God reveals himself one way in the book of Job, and he reveals himself the same way in the books of Moses, he's not going to reveal himself differently in a book he writes later. We also have this fact that once God reveals something about himself, he's not going to change what he's revealed. Now, he does add what he revealed to himself in the Garden of Eden was just the very basic bones. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. Wow. The first prophecy of a virgin birth. The first promise of a Messiah. And all we know is that it's the seed of the woman, and it's going to be a male, and somehow he is going to smash the head of Satan. That's all he said. He does not lie. He does not change. And so as a result, every revelation about this spiritual conflict has to involve the seed of the woman. It has to involve a fatal wound to Satan, and it has to come from a male. He adds to this information. We find out that this seed of the woman is going to become God born into human flesh. We're going to find that he was born in Bethlehem. We're going to find he was part of the tribe of Judah. We're going to find that he was part of the line of David. He'll add information. But that seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent does not change. That is always consistent. So this means that any new revelation that God delivers, including another testament of Jesus Christ. This is the new revelation. And if you listen to the Latter-day Saints, they'll say, oh, this is the new revelation. God changed his mind. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Malachi, I change not. Well, that's not true. See, God changed his mind, now God changes. God can decide who's going to be a God and who's not going to be a God. No, I change not. So we take the older revelation, welcome to the Bible, and we take all the new revelations and test it against the old. The Latter-day Saints want us to reverse that and to test the old by the new. That's not how it works. So if the new revelation is different, if it says something that contradicts the earlier revelation, that revelation is not of God. So the New Testament also made this observation about God. This is from the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, verse 18. It is impossible for God to lie. God does not have that ability within him. His makeup is such that he can only tell the truth every time. He can never lie. So, working with just these two concepts, these two truths as their guide, that God does not change and God does not lie, this is how we get to here. From point A to point B, this is point B. Point A is the book of Job. Now this task first fell to the Jews. For 2,000 years, this was their task. Their rabbis went through document after document, revelation after revelation. And there were a lot of things that they decided did not comply with what God had already said about himself. They compared them to the earliest revelations that God gave us. They contradicted, and if they contradicted what God said, they were rejected. Great big red rejection stamp. I haven't seen that in archaeological finds yet with the big red rejection stamp, but it was probably there somewhere. Now, we also have the test of prophets. You know, Joseph Smith claimed that God told him he was a prophet. And he claimed that his gospel, this Book of Mormon, was given to him by an angel. Did you know the New World Translations claim that they are prophets? Now, they don't claim an individual prophet. They claim that the leadership as a whole has the gift of prophecy. And they also claim that there is an angel standing next to their president all the time. Every time there's a new president, that's the angel, and that angel is guiding them. What did Paul say in Galatians? If we or an angel from heaven deliver any other gospel than the one that we have preached to you, let them be accursed. So, one, it doesn't match up with what God has revealed about himself. Two, they claim it came from an angel. And three, as prophets, we have to put them to the test. So there is a test for prophets in the Bible. These prophets were correct 100% of the time. Every prophecy that they made, no matter how many details was in that prophecy, it had to come true. Now, if they made a prophecy and that prophecy did not come true, and their writings were rejected. Oh, and there's another problem if you happen to be a prophet and you give a prophecy and it doesn't come true. They were taken out and stoned to death. Now, this is a good point to make my new public service announcement. I have a public service announcement. One of the things that has been really hard for me is to go through all the information on all of the different cults. And there is just so much information out there. And I have to pull from all these different resources, all these different documents, all these different reports. And I'm putting them together in our PowerPoint presentations that are supposed to take about an hour and a half. And I'm allowed to do this 6 times. Well, I finally talked to our pastors, Pastor Rex and Pastor Jack. I had a meeting with Dave, and I'm going to do an extended session. Not longer than an hour and a half, but I'm going to create a 7th class. Now, if you want to come to the class, that's fine. If you don't want to come to the class, that's fine. I'll just cry myself to sleep. But there was one topic that I felt really needed to have special attention by its own separate class and not to get mixed in. So this last class that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to call that Prophets and Priests. And I'm going to look at the Mormons as prophets of God. I'm going to look at the Jehovah's Witnesses as prophets of God. I'm going to look at the Latter-day Saints claiming that they have the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood. What does the Bible say about that? And what is the priesthood of the believer and why we have it and they don't? So I'll be finishing up the class with these traditional 6 classes, but I'll come back, and if you want to tune in or look us up later, there will be that additional 7th class available for you. So this standard was carried over into the New Testament. And again, we're talking documents that were tested for probably about 1,000 years. And even today, there are still debates over these documents. One of the big things that pops up is the end of the Gospel of Mark. According to one of the translations, the Gospel of Mark was cut off at the death of Jesus. There was no resurrection. And all these things that Mark is saying at the end of that book were not, quote, in the original text. And what you find out if you go back, you're going to discover that there are several different manuscripts. And the people that did the King James Bible selected very specific manuscripts because they had credibility. They had been tested. They were trustworthy. But there was one guy, the Alexandrian Codex. And this person who wrote the Alexandrian Codex was one man. It wasn't a committee. And he personally did not believe in the divinity of Jesus. And so when he wrote the Alexandrian Codex, he edited out every reference to any miracle that Jesus performed, any reference that Jesus claimed to be God. He took it all out. And so the one translation that used the Alexandrian Codex cuts off at that point in Mark, because this thing about the Holy Spirit, this thing about being bitten by serpents, this thing about drinking poison, oh, that's all supernatural. He didn't like the supernatural. And what's amazing is that we can prove, historically, we can prove that those statements were in the older manuscripts and he edited them out. You see, there is more than just copies of the Bible running around. There are people back during the time of the early church that used to write letters to each other. Paul wrote letters. John wrote letters. Other people wrote letters. There also were people who kept diaries. And we find, looking at these diaries and looking at these letters, people were actually quoting these verses from Mark that weren't in the original text. Now, talk about your miracle. They saw the future. And they saw these verses that were going to be, quote, added after the fact, hundreds of years later, and they wrote them down for future reference. So we're still testing the documents. Every document holds up to these tests. Now, when it came time to translate, and here I'm just going to stop for a second and mention the New World Translation. As best I can tell, this is not a translation. This is an alteration. They took the King James Bible and they altered it to say what they wanted it to say. And then they made up all these interesting arguments to support their changes. And if you look at what they're claiming, they were claiming about 7 or 8 different Hebrew manuscripts and 3 or 4 Greek references and a couple of Armenian references. But they didn't use the same manuscripts that the King James Bible people did. So I wonder how they ended up getting a translation that was so close to the King James Bible, even to how they worded things. Now, let me have a confession. I like to collect comic books. And this is out of a very interesting comic book. This is a publisher. I'm going to plug them because they let me use this. This is a publisher called Kingstone Comics, and you can find them on the internet. And what they did is they started making comic book versions of the entire Bible. They have a 3-volume hardback edition of the Bible with very high quality artwork and very high quality writing. Now, this is a book that was put together by them, and it was called The Word of God. And this character here is actually a characterization of the publisher at Kingstone Comics. And he's talking about the King James Bible. King James put together 6 teams of scholars: Westminster, Cambridge, Oxford. And they had 2 teams from Westminster, 2 from Cambridge, and 2 from Oxford. And they came from Puritan churches, and they came from the Church of England. And altogether, he says, there's about 50 different scholars that are working on this. Each team had a different part of the Bible. The one team up here from Westminster did Genesis to the book of 2 Kings. The Cambridge team had Romans to Jude, in other words, all the letters. Oxford had 1 Chronicles to Ecclesiastes. The secondary team from Westminster did the Apocrypha. The second team from Cambridge did Isaiah to Malachi. And then the Oxford team, the second team, did the Gospels, the book of Acts, and Revelation. So we have 50 different people working on this, putting it together. But that wasn't enough. Once they finished doing all their translations, after the groups were done with their sections, they sent 2 members from each of these 6 groups to form another committee. And this committee of the, I think it was 6 groups, it'd be 12 people, were doing the final review and checking and double checking everybody's translations against the original manuscripts. They finalized everything so that it could be published. Now, when they were finished, it was sent to several different church leaders, people that were in charge of several churches, and they said, take a look at this. See what it looks like. Is there anything that doesn't look right to you? Finally, in 1611, King James became the authorized version. In fact, it's kind of funny. If you look at a King James Bible, it's copyright free because it was done back in 1611. But if you're using it in England, you have to identify who the publisher was because it's still protected by the crown. It's had a number of revisions since then, but it still is the best copy of the English language translation. Now, here's the nice thing about this. Despite their very best efforts, there were still some errors that popped in. Let me give you the most obvious. The guards are coming to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And John is giving this account. And Judas comes in and kisses Jesus. And Jesus looks at the guards and says, "Whom do you seek?" Now, who are you looking for? And they say, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." Now, in the King James, Jesus' response is, "I am he." And if you look in the King James Bible, you find that little "he" is in italics. What that means is it was not in the original manuscript. They kept very careful notes to changes and additions that they made. And when he said, "I am he," all the guards and Judas fell to the ground and couldn't get up. That doesn't make any sense in that translation. Take out the "he." Remove that little italics of "he." "Whom seek ye?" "We seek Jesus of Nazareth." "I am. I am that I am." That is the name for God that God gave Moses at the burning bush. The name of God, I'm sorry guys, is not Jehovah. God declares his name is I am. And when Jesus declared himself to be God and used the name of God, the power of God drove them to the ground. So there have been changes. There have been some things they thought they were doing they should have done, but over the years we've discovered where those things are. So yes, even though there may be some translation errors here and there, it does not change the original text. It does not change the original meaning. If you're looking for a translation, this is probably your best bet, because this translation has been around since 1611, and every scholar on the face of the earth has had their hands on this and taken it apart and tested it and challenged it and come back to recognize what it says. So it's probably the most accurate and the most tested of all the different translations out there. So when they're talking about the additional information or the revisions, you know, it's just things that make the text more accurate. It does not change the basic information. We find something new in an archaeological dig. We have somebody who is a linguist specialist, and they go through and they say, wait a second, this word has several meanings. One of the things that I found was interesting was in the book of Malachi, and it talks about that the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. Wow, that's impressive. Had a friend who studied Hebrew. He says, well, they kind of made a mistake. And here's where the problem comes in. In Hebrew, back then, they did not use vowels. All they had were consonants. So no A, E, I, O, U. They added those later. And what that means is that you're looking at the vowels, and if you use these consonants, you add these vowels, it gives you one Hebrew word. But if you used a different set of vowels, you get another Hebrew word. And when you're talking about arising with healing in his wings, that's the exact situation. If you use these set of vowels for those letters, it's the Hebrew word for wings. But If you change those vowels and use those consonant, it is the word talis, which refers to the hem of the garment. Where do you think the woman with the issue of blood got the idea, if I can just touch the hem of his garment? She got it from that verse in Malachi. She was a Hebrew. She knew how to read it. She understood the difference. The scholars who put this together many years later made the mistake by not properly considering all the possibilities. We know that now. We can correct that. The linguists showed us our mistake. So, the sun shall arise with healing in the hem of his garments. Who touched the hem and was healed? The woman with the issue of blood. Whose garments was she touching? She was touching Jesus's hem. So, again, these changes make some of the passages easier to understand, but they've never altered the original teachings of the Bible. Now, let's jump over. We've taken care of the Bible. That's God's contract. The Latter-day Saints has added what they call another testament of Jesus Christ, the Book of Mormon. This book is believed to have been translated from something called golden plates. Now, this is from the 3rd edition of the Book of Mormon back in 1830. And it says here, an account written by the hand of Mormon. Did you know Mormon was actually a person who was supposed to have lived many years before Joseph Smith? I think he was the father of Moroni, the angel. And it was upon plates that were taken from the plates of the Nephi. And there were supposed to be golden plates that were available. If you want an artist's rendition, this is what they put together. Like a 3-ring binder. And these are all golden plates, plates of actual gold. It's here among the leaves because according to Joseph Smith, it had been buried away. And the angel Moroni showed him where they were. And he was not allowed to take possession of them for quite some time. And these plates were reported to have something called Reformed Egyptian. How many have heard of Reformed Egyptian outside of the Latter-day Saints? Not one archaeological dig in Egypt, in America, in Europe, in Africa, has ever come across a reference of any language called Reformed Egyptian. There were no samples of it like hieroglyphics, but Joseph Smith said these were written in Reformed Egyptian. And this Reformed Egyptian was the perfect language to use because it could take a lot of information and compress them down into just a few symbols. So this is the golden plates that he had the chance to translate. Now the translation was the work of one man, not 50 scholars. It was the work of one man. The Book of Mormon, translated by Joseph Smith, 1840. Now, I want you to notice something. When we were talking about the previous document, this was in 1830. And there's nothing here about revisions. But when we get over here to this document, right in the middle it says 3rd edition, carefully revised by the translator. Keep that thought in mind. I want to come back to it in a few minutes. So the translator would be Joseph Smith. Look at how he is depicted in this artwork. He is wearing what they called the ephod, the breastplate of the high priest. And connected to the ephod is this little set of spectacles, glasses. And he described them as lenses in silver bows. So based upon how he described the translation process, that's how this picture was put together. He sat there behind a screen because you can't look on the golden plates and live. They were that holy. They were that special. And through these glasses, he was able to read the Reformed Egyptian and write it down. That's how he described it. That's how the church historians drew this.